Habari gani, karibuni, wanakumbukeni. Today we're going on live earlier than usual. And in the spirit of the conversation we're going to have today, I'm actually recognizing this early rise and what the Kenya Land and Freedom Army had to go through is nothing compared to that. But again, we are joined today by a very, I was going to say special, but we have a guest with us today that is very knowledgeable about the subject that we'll be talking about, and I'm excited about that. My name is Nduku. I am an African woman, a Black woman. As you can see, they tell me this color is black. Last time I checked, it was brown. Who is done with the imperialist and exploitative systems and is doing something about it to make a change. Brothers.
Yes, the name is Adesoji Iginla, and reaching you here from the United Kingdom, the mother of imperialists, and unfortunately one who is at this. Unfortunately, one who is at the centerpiece of the conversation we're about to have. And yes, again, welcome to Kumbukeni, brothers.
Karibuni, comrades. Milton Allimadi from New York City. The declining imperial power.
For a minute, I thought you froze.
The declining imperial power, which also had a lot to do with the conversation that we're having today in support of the kith and kin in what was then colonial Kenya. So welcome to Chuo Kikuu, our global university, weekly university. Over to you, Nduku Colin.
Yes, I'm Colin Benjamin. I'm also here in New York. I work with Comrade Milton as the editor of Black Star News, as well as on the Black Star News show, WBAI. And I don't know if Brother Milton is aware of this, but next year, man, it's going to be 20 years.
Oh my goodness!
Working with this.
Wow.
Your comrade.
Yeah. Wow, right? I know, because
you're scaring me. You're scaring me.
I know. I'm scaring myself too. Like, damn. Yeah.
There's a baby that just became an adult in the time that the two of you have been on those airwaves, right?
Well, no, we haven't been on WBA either long, but me and him have been collaborating and working together. I don't know that. See, he's surprised. I don't think you remember that, because I first met Brother Milton in 2004 at what is it, Harriet Tubman? What is it, high school, junior high school in Harlem.
Yeah, interesting.
And when Brother Ilambre Brath, who was now an ancestor, had a program, and Brother Milton was one of the speakers there.
I would love to hear those stories someday. Maybe we can all sit and share. The three of us or more are invited. Professor Munene, if you want to join us, we can all sit and talk about the 20 years of their experience over some food and good drinks. Professor Munene.
Sounds like a good idea.
Right? Some ugali and nyamachoma and kachumbari.
Yes.
Our guest today is Professor Macharia Munene. He is a professor in Kenya of history at the USIU, University of United States, USIU, International University in Nairobi. And he's also a contributor in many spaces, in both written form and spoken form, political analyst. And for those of you who want to learn more about Professor Munene, we have in our description all the books he's written, so you can go read, you can go support and look at his work. But I'll let Professor Munene introduce himself, please, Professor.
Thank you very much. Good to be part of this talk. My name is Macharia Munene, a Kenyan, and as introduced, Professor of History and International Relations at the United States International University in Nairobi. I am interested in a lot of things, both as thought provocation and as advocacy and raising issues, concerns that should be addressed. And in my columns, which I write, and books and articles, I try to address something that is nagging at the time, or something that needs to be looked into. And then are long lasting. Like the issue of the Mau Mau is one of the lasting ones, and having to respond to some of the challenges that come up in terms of ideas, and sometimes trying to beat up on the Mau Mau in the name of scholarship. All those things do happen all the time. They're happening even now, and we can see it. So how to respond to such things is one thing. Of course, issues of national concern. If something is happening in Kenya or the world, sometimes I try to put in my 2 cents worth. And sometimes I get listened to, and most of the time I'm in, which is okay. They say, but at least I have that freedom.
Yes.
Be free to say what I think, write what I think.
Yes.
The publishers have a right also not to publish.
True.
Brother Allimadi has a history with that.
Yes.
So we have something in common in that,
Yes, you
in
do.
that regard.
Yes, you do.
My pleasure to be here to discuss.
Thank you so much.
Issues.
All right. So I think a good place to start would be for you to share with our community your connection with the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. And I refuse to call them the Mau Mau just because the term was used to villainize them, right? So I'm bringing the heroism, the warrior in them by calling them what they wanted to be known as the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. And that is what they were fighting for, the land and the freedom of Kenya. So please, if you can talk to us a little bit about your connection, direct and distance with them.
But in addition to that, I think for some of the listeners, it would be beneficial if the professor can also tell listeners what actually was the Kenya Land and Freedom Army.
Yes, please.
Yeah, a brief history.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Briefly, the Land and Freedom Army was the armed wing of demanding political liberation. And its background is long. Some people would like to trace it back to the 1920s with the Harry Nduku agitation, where there was some shooting, where the University of Nairobi is at present, and has produced one of the heroines of the day, Mary Muthoni Nyanjiro. And when he was locked up, the rise of the organizations that would be agitating not only for his return, but also for more rights. And it is one of those organizations that sent Jomo Kenyatta to England twice, and he stayed there for a long time. But out of that, he was able to write a book challenging colonial benevolence. Facing Mount Kenya was not so much about how the Kikuyu eat and sleep and do other things. That one can get anywhere. But the challenge to the colonial benevolence and the claim to speak for Africans was the novelty. And that's what people liked about it. Now, after World War II, there were two forces, if I may say, that dominated the world. The emerging Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and then the anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist movement that was mainly in Asia and Africa. The two forces were in collision. So, and then the Africans and Kenya was part of that. Now, when they met at Manchester in 1945, those who participated said they were going to do everything and everything to destroy imperialism and colonialism, even if it meant destruction of the world. That's what they said. And some people were surprised and bothered, but it didn't matter. The implementation of those resolutions was first in the Gold Coast, and then it was the Gold Coast is okay because there are no white people there, so no danger. But in the Eastern African section, where the settlerdom was prominent, it was not expected that there could be such a challenge. Although they used to worry about a disease called Gold Coastism to be avoided. And when the British were kicked out of the Middle East, they thought they could entrench in Kenya, as they call it, Kenya, not Kenya, because there was a large white population. It was safe. You should read Ernest Hemingway when he talks about this, how the white settlers and other people used to enjoy here, they were in paradise, they were all kings of some sort. So imagine this picture, what Julius Kano called some sort of a paradise, Shangri-La, where they could do anything, they are safe. But at the same time, while the whites were enjoying the dissatisfaction of the ordinary people. So when they came from the war, the World War II, they were cheated. And they resented that. The white people were rewarded with more land. And the Africans were cheated. And so the resentment that came with it. And during the war, when they fought there, they were being asked, what are you fighting for? You cannot say you're fighting for freedom. Who are you fighting for? So the whole colonial setup became questionable. Now, during that war, before and during, there were agitations for Africans to be allowed to speak for themselves. And people like Mbio Koinange became very famous for that. And Jomo Kenyatta himself, his friend. Now, Mbio Koinange thought that he would be the one to be appointed when the time came. Instead, the colonialists looked for an African who was compliant, who could speak very good English, Oxford English, had not been a problem. He went Fort Hare instead of going to America, and he agreed to teach at a lower salary than white people, although they were less qualified than he was. So he was not a trouble. So they put him there as an experimental person. And people, they said, okay, he's there, he's ours. So they turned things around and decided to create an organization, the elite at that time, to help him get information in order to deal with issues that come in the legical from an informed position. So they created something they called Kenya African Study Union. After a year or so of studying, they got tired of studying. So they dropped the S and it became Kenya African Union, the political movement now. That's the movement that Kenyatta joined in 1946 when he returned. And at first he wanted to help the colonial government. They didn't want his help. After all, he was just a native. And the natives go and work in local district councils. So joining this movement, he did something which many people did not expect. He told them, look, whatever you do, let your friends abroad know. So he was in contact with Du Bois. They together sent a petition to the United Nations after the Manchester Conference. And he had contact. So he told people, look, whatever you do, let your friends know.
Is this the Pan-African Manchester Congress you're speaking of?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So now he's returned home and he's telling people, let people know. So if you go to Spingarn Library at Howard University, you are going to find cow documents there from the 1940s. So when I was doing some work there, I found it. So I asked one of those guys, how come? And he said, Kenyatta told us to be doing that. Because when the time comes, you may need their help. And he was right, because when he was in trouble, they came to help him. Along with that political mobilization, people like Jaramogi Oginga Odinga were recruited by Kenyatta into politics. So Kenyatta's message was mobilize political fever and fervor, so that people became more and more. When you talk to them, say, yeah, Kenyatta told us this, Kenyatta told us this, Kenyatta told us this. And along with that was now the other movement, which was saying talking is not helping very much.
Yeah.
Let's start organizing something. So by 1947, you could read some documents talking about some people called Mau Mau. They didn't know what it was, but Mau Mau. So you get some documents to that effect. But they themselves did not call themselves that. The way it supposedly came was because when they are meeting in the whatever the huts or places, and security forces will be coming, maybe somebody will say, hey, there's a problem, eh? Get out, eh? So in the Kro language, to say get out, Uma. If it's repeated many times, it will sound like what?
That's what my argument has been, right?
Uma, 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 uma. So then the security forces, what they had was that. Yeah? Mau, mau, mau. So they are saying there's a movement like that. But they've never called them that, themselves that. The other argument, which sounds more entertaining than real, was that they were saying Mzungu aenda Ulaya, Mwafrika apate uhuru. So the abbreviations of that. I think that's more entertaining than real, but it sounds good. Because I remember.
Professor, could you translate that for listeners? The Kiswahili.
Oh yeah, the Mzungu aenda Ulaya. The white man go to England, go to Europe, so that the African can get independence. So Mzungu is the white man. Aenda is to go. Ulaya is Europe. Mwafrika, the African, apate to get uhuru.
You against Mau Mau. Okay.
Mau Mau.
So Mau Mau. So they sounded nice. But the like movement for now, physical violent agitation, military agitation, started with people taking oaths. As far back as 1947 or thereabout, there were, and Chief Koinange was associated with it. Koinange Wambiu. Now, those people who became militant were among the earlier groups to take the oath. The likes of Jesse Karaoke was the administrator. Dedan Kimathi took it. Madenge took it. China took it. So those people who were initially entrusted with it took the oath, the unity, they were calling the unity oath. And then have to unite everybody. And the message they were being told everywhere is that the oath was to unite people, not to fight initially, but to unite people. Then as the time came, once the night the emergency was declared, of course they now took some arms. They had been preparing. There are stories of some ammunition initially coming from Ethiopia. At least in the Meru part. When you talk to them, they tell you, yes, Haile Selassie was somehow helping. And by 1948, they can say they had some, which Kenyatta told them to keep safe in a place. There was also a growing challenge, people who were seen to be very close collaborators, that they were enemies of the people. So we had the incidents of people being shot at. One of them, the leading collaborators at the time was a city of Nairobi, county of Nairobi councillor, one of the few councillors. And when Nairobi was being made a city, they needed signatures from all the races. So this man who signed for it, people decided to shoot at him because he's a traitor. He survived, and then he had to beg Kenyatta for help. Because one of people said, hey, you're going to die. Go and apologize.
Do we have a name for this? Do we have a name for him?
Yeah, Mushoge Konyo. Mushoge Konyo. Actually, he's a distant relative.
Oh, God.
I have some of those in my family. But go on.
Yes. So, but he appealed to Kenyatta for help. Actually, my uncle told him, go and appeal for help. So even then, Kenyatta took him to the public and said, listen, this young man was lost. He has now come back. And he was never touched again. What I may be driving there is the ambivalence of Kenyatta.
Yes.
Did he have a role in the Mau Mau or not? Many people insist he had no role, which is a lie. Because when you talk to the people, they say Kenyatta told us. So that, but he was a person, a very good political opportunist. He knew what to say to whom, when.
Right.
And so there are Englishmen who vouch by their gods that he never had anything to do with it. And the others would say the other. Anyway, so then you have other people being killed because they were collaborators.
Right.
The main one being Chief Warohio.
Correct.
Whom the Europeans used to call the African Churchill because he was such a good collaborator.
Right.
But when he died, that became now the spark.
For the...
And the declaration of emergency.
Right. In 1952.
1952. A few months after Elizabeth stopped watching animals at treetops.
I'm so glad you just called her Elizabeth. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Now, with the declaration of emergency, an attempt, the thinking was you round up the leaders, the cow leaders. Then the problems went. Because these people would not have any leaders.
Correct.
That was the colonial thinking. But then some of these people had already started moving into formations. The first real commander was Stanley Madenge. And Kimathi was the Secretary General because he could read and write, he was literate. Madenge was not. And that's how now Kimathi's reputation goes up because he was the one communicating to the officials.
Correct.
Now, what they formed was the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army. And they were the ones responsible for various activities. They accomplished a few things. They also lost. The best of their fighters, so it said, was General Kago Wamboko. And the man was had fought in World War II. So he knew his ways in terms of war. And sometimes he would impersonate officials, go in a place and just take over. Or sometimes he would announce he's coming, I'm coming to beat you up. And then he shows up and goes.
I like him.
So there was that, on the British side, there was that impression. This is a local little thing that can be done in 3 months. 4 months. So you arrest the leaders, they finish everything. Unfortunately, it did not go that way. Lasted a year and it's still not over. 2 years is not over. 3 years is not over. 4 years, something is wrong. It is not a matter of the military operations. In fact, the general, Aiskan, I think, they said, no, this is not a military thing. It's a political what? So until you address the political issue, you are wasting your time.
So
now, that war had been predicted 50 years before by Francis Hall. And Francis Hall was one of those conquerors. In fact, a whole district was named after him when he died. But he concluded, he had said that the way he sees things going, there will be a war between the whites and the blacks. And he will not want to be there when it happens. Another one who predicted that was Captain Menatsagen. He is well known for killing old Coyote, Koitalera.
Yeah.
Betrayed him and killed him. He also had said, the way things are going, there will be a friction between the whites and the what?
The Africans.
And the black. Especially with dispossessions.
Right.
So
when
that happens,
Professor, just a quick interjection. Some listeners may not be familiar with the extent of the injustice, the land dispossession. Could you just give them a number? How many Europeans were allocated how much land that previously belonged to Africans, so they can
the number kept on changing because it started around 1902. You know, after the construction of the railroad, there was effort to recruit the aristocrats, people of means. They didn't want to have white people there at the time. And you have all these royalties. That's why the king owns a lot of land in Kenya. And they really grabbed thousands and thousands, but they were a small number. After the Great War, World War I, there was effort to reward British soldiers with land in Kenya. The soldier settlement scheme, bringing 20,000 of them. And where you're getting the land, you dispossess the people who are there. Like the Muru here, the White Highlands, the so-called White. The reason they were called White Highlands was because only white people were supposed to own land there. And then the areas of Gelmarakwet, Uasin Gishu, all those Nakuru, parts of Laikipia. So they gave them a lot of land, thousands of acres, and dispossessed a lot of people in order for those to get that.
And you can still see that today if you drive from Nairobi on Rift Valley Road, that whole area, you pass by Delamere land. But go on, Professor.
Which I understand he sold, or his killer, the Delamere's grandchild, the one who was killing people.
Yes.
And he died. So I understand the land has been sold to some African.
Okay.
Now, the injustice of the land, dispossession, was one of the genesis of the agitation for war. And so the Kenya Land and Freedom Army used to fight talking about land and freedom. We are the Naidaka. But there is a song like that. So they were fighting for land and freedom. And Kenyatta was their spiritual titular leader in that. But the actual fighting itself were those people who ended up in the forest. People like Kimathi and China and Matenjago and Boko and Mwariama and all those.
Quickly, Professor Munene, how does the KLFA transition from Kimau being, we have been told by, Kenyatta, them saying we've been told by Kenyatta, to Dedan Kimathi being the leader? How do we transition? What happens there for Dedan to take over?
No, Kenyatta was the political leader.
Right.
And even the people in the forest, the detention camps, they recognize him as what? As the leader. These others in the forest were now the fighters for the actual thing.
The military
leaders were in jail, but the fighting continued. So when the political leaders are in jail, the fighting leaders are the ones you talk about.
Right.
So and since Kimathi had a way of communicating, he ended up people talking about him. He's the one who sent messages. He's the one who did that. In fact, in 1954, Mbio Koinange published a little book, people of Kenya speaking for themselves, where he praised Kimathi as the leader, that it is possible to stop this war if you talk to Kimathi, which also tells you something. So the Kimathi's reputation grew with time. In fact, there is a story when they were meeting in Kaloleni, and Kenyatta had asked his comrade Jesse whether there were enough people. In Kikuyu, he asked, Adonia Igana, are there enough people? And before Jesse could reply, it was Kimathi who replied and said, yes, they are there. We have enough people. Meaning what? So he was already a notable man, being the cow leader in Yahuru area. And so he was known to be a radical in his way. It said that he used to imagine himself, even in the forest, as the Kenyan Mossadegh, Mohammed Mossadegh of Iran. It's, the connectivity.
Okay, so
that
Professor,
it was not just a local affair; it could be international.
Professor,
So Kenya's reputation went on.
On that note, perhaps you could elaborate a little bit on Dedan Kimathi, who became the leader of the Kenya Land and Freedom Army and the military commander as well. He's living at a time where Africans have not been given opportunities for higher education, and yet he seemed to be very ahead of his time in many respects. He's familiar with what is happening on a global scene in terms of resistance against imperialism. You are mentioning now, this is the first time I'm hearing this, about him relating to Mohammed Mossadegh, who of course Americans would be familiar with as the Iranian Democrat, legitimately elected prime minister who was overthrown by the United States and Britain to reimpose the Shah back in power. So as I'm listening to this, I'm wondering, how did Kimathi become this sophisticated in global affairs, domestic affairs, the militancy that he adopted, the strategies that he adopted, the guerrilla strategy? It's very difficult to imagine somebody coming up with something like this without formal training. Even the ones who fought for African liberation in the 1970s, many of them were sent to train in China or in the Soviet Union to gain this expertise. How did this individual come up with so much expertise and skills on his own?
And just to piggyback on your question, sorry, Professor Munene, to piggyback on Allimadi's question, he also traveled through Africa and to Palestine. So if you can attach both of Allimadi's question and that travel to Palestine. Yes, please.
To start with, he went to school. The amount of schooling that he was allowed to be able to read and write. In fact, he became a teacher before he went to the forest to teach other people, this sort of thing. So he was literate. And part of being literate was also to be aware of what's going on. So being aware of what was going on, he became a member of KAU, the political organization that matured in the 1940s. And as a leader of KAU, it was his business to know, because as they were being told, there are other people who are doing the same thing. So if the grievance is against the British, which it was, where else are the British having problems? And they knew that the British had been kicked out of Palestine. And when the British were building the big military barracks at Kahawa, that was built as a place of entrenchment for the British Empire, supply center for the military, because they could not be in the Middle East. And that was when they thought that they were safe. So the leaders of KAU, of which Kimathi became one, were aware of all these things. They were aware of what had happened in the Gold Coast before it became Ghana. And some of them were saying, yeah, that sounds good. And Kimathi was an organizer, by his temperament. And that's why he ended up being the leader of KAU. Now, it is said that his interaction with Kenyatta was not the best. Because when Kenyatta visited his area where he was, he seemed to have visited with one of the tycoons, one of the rich people, who was not an official of KAU. So Kimathi was not very happy. So he is the leader of KAU, and he is the leader of the movement, associating with somebody who is not the official leader. Some people would, in fact, I talked to one veteran who told me that could be the genesis of the problem, because Kenyatta was not behaving as they expected. And some would go to the extent of saying maybe the influence of his English wife was pronounced in those things. But Kimathi was a very knowledgeable man, and he was also a crafty man. He was a manipulator, political manipulator. And as a political manipulator, he knew what to do. And that's when they went into the forest, he ended up taking over from Madenge. Because initially it was Madenge who was in charge. But Madenge was illiterate and not a very good organizer.
Right.
Kimathi was an organizer. And he knew how to advocate for himself, or push his wisdom and expertise. Kimathi was not a very good Democrat in that sense. They ask them, they'll tell you.
It's funny you say that, Professor Munene, because as I was reading, and we put the books in the chat, in the comments for all of you, but I'm just gonna hold it up for those who will be watching the video later.
Yeah.
But as I was reading, this is a record of a lot of the Kenya Land and Freedom Army letters,
Yes.
diary entries, journals, meeting records. And this was driven by Dedan Kimathi. But also, I disagree that he wasn't a Democrat, because even in one of the meetings, he is confronted about something he had done, and he has to admit that he was wrong and say that he is going to follow the rules that they have all agreed they should all follow. Because to them, it was very important that the leadership is strong and it's not flawed, because that would kill the motivation from their followers, right? So please speak to that, because there's so much villainizing of the Kenya Land and Freedom Army and of Dedan Kimathi. So these good aspects of them as men who are willing to put away their ego and fight for their country and put that first is something good to highlight. So please, how organized he was and how much of a team player he was.
No, he was a leader, and he organized the Kenya Parliament. And in the Kenya Parliament, people could speak. He was also a disciplinarian, and this you get directly from the people who are with him, whom I talked to. In terms of discipline, once they have agreed on this or said this is the way, no deviation. So they addressed that, said, yeah, you don't do some things. So that's the context in which I said that.
Right.
Yes, there was a Kenya Parliament. Yes, there was consultations. Sometimes the consultations went haywire, and strange things happened. Okay.
He was ultimately the commander-in-chief.
Yes, he was.
Yeah, he was. The commanders don't argue too many times.
Right.
Once the policy has been set.
When Fidel Castro was at Sierra, when Fidel Castro was leading the war against Batista, I imagine it would be this similar circumstance. So, Professor, could you briefly also mention Mathenge himself? Because ultimately, he, quote unquote, disappeared. And even up today, he's not officially recorded as dead, even though he would have to be 104 years old if he was still alive, whatever he is today. Could you speak briefly about that?
Mathenge is one of the three mysteries about the Mau Mau, the Kenya Land and Freedom. He's one of the mysteries. As we said, he started as the overall commander. And then Kimathi took over. Now, he had serious military experience in World War II. And it is said that in those formative stages, the cow leaders and their militant wing wanted people who had experience. That's how Mathenge comes into the picture. As a good fighter who had experience. I had the privilege of talking to his wife. She's still alive and can tell you nice stories about him. But while they were in the forest, he and Kimathi quarreled. The source of that quarrel is another matter.
I think that's he was saying Kimathi is presuming to be a leader, and he didn't want. I think he even refuses to show up for one of the conferences they have, right?
They had a few conflicts, and then so Mathenge left. So they separated. In the same way, actually, General Kago separated from Kimathi because they had differences. Now, it is then said that that's when he went to Ethiopia. And there is a debate as to whether he actually went. The claim is that he was killed. A number of people are saying he was killed in a particular battle and all those kind of things. Therefore, he never went. But nobody saw him dead. But they keep on saying he was killed in a particular place. Okay. Now, the possibility of him going to Ethiopia is linked to another claim. That when Haile Selassie was being returned to Ethiopia by the British, among his bodyguards were some Kenyan people. And Mathenge was one of them. And another fellow called General I think I will remember his name, that he was a Meru guy, that he was actually Ethiopia's bodyguard. And therefore they knew they knew. So when they claimed that some weapons were being brought from Ethiopia, it was through that connection. So if it is true, then he knew his way. And so he went and he got settled. For a long time, people knew that he had disappeared. And it was said he went to Ethiopia. How many they were, nobody knows for sure. Now, years later, you have this story, Joseph Karemi, the journalist, who went digging and said he'd found him. And they talked. So the story of Mavenge in Ethiopia became one of interest. By then, the talk of Mau Mau was not very encouraged. When Mwai Kibaki became president, and he opened up, legalized Mau Mau as a movement, because it was illegal all this time. So he made it legal. And then there was a claim that Mavenge, who is said to be in Ethiopia, should be brought. And he was invited. And the Kenya government put him in a nice hotel for a whole week. But then the paradox was that he left Addis Ababa as Mavenge. It's only 2 hours flight. And he landed in Nairobi saying he was not Mavenge. So you say, what's going on? What happened between Addis Ababa and Nairobi?
Safety, his safety. That's what happened. But Professor,
Yes.
as you continue, I realize my brothers Adesoji and Colin have said nothing. Do you have any questions for Professor?
I have
Munene?
a question, Brother Colin. You go first.
Well, let me ask this. Speak a little bit more. A while ago, you talked about some of, the warriors who had been in World War II. Speak a little bit more about that, about how much of the composition of the Kenya Land and Freedom Army would have been people who had served in World War II. And speak a little bit more about the specific guerrilla tactics that were used against the British.
Can I add to that? I'm going to jump on everyone's cause. In that also, if you can speak to the fact that they made their own guns, because it's tied to what Brother Colin just asked, please.
Okay. In the forest, let me talk about the linkage between the forest and the urban areas.
Good.
Because the urban areas supplied the resources. And people like Joseph Murumbi in his writings would claim how they used to do it. The former vice president got in trouble. But the leaders, those who had military experience, became the leaders now. And the way they would acquire weapons would be to raid a place, a police station, like the way they raided Naivasha. They will raid a place like Lemuru, and they'll get all the weapons there. Go and use it. Or they'll raid Mzungu's place because they kept guns, and then they'll get them. But beyond, when they engage in the military exercise with the security forces, and they want them out, then they'll get those guns and turn them around. And General Kago was very good in those kind of things, getting weapons from the enemy, and then they turn them around. They also made their own guns because they had that. They knew that some of them were very good smiths, so they made their own guns, and they would dismantle, reorganize, and today we have some women who can tell you how they did that, because they did.
In fact, it was a requirement, right? It was a requirement for each unit to have a gun processing.
To be able to look after itself and to get them where. How you get them is not the issue, but just get them. And they did that. They also had an elaborate intelligence system. In fact, I've written an article on that. The intelligence system. Go, do. Particularly children and young women who are very good in those things. Because they look innocent. So they are the ones to get and go and report it is happening over there. So their knowledge system was fairly good in terms of preparing, because then that's what helped them to stay longer than expected.
As you're speaking, I'm thinking of the Battle of Algiers as you're speaking about their clandestine organizations.
You're saying the battles?
The Battle of Algiers, the film about the Algerian resistance, the Battle of Algiers. It's very similar type of tactic.
Yeah, the way they went about gathering weapons.
I know about a little bit about the Battle of Algiers. And interestingly, the Algerian War came after the Mau Mau War.
Exactly. So they might have actually learned from Kenya.
So that's how
especially if Kimathi was going throughout Africa. So
all those things there. So then it's Nelson Mandela who said that Kimathi was his hero. So they did have some elaborate ways. Although we have to admit that their operations were succeeding up to 1954. And then, particularly after the capture of General China, the operations methods were discovered. And so there was a big crackdown in Nairobi as the source of some of these things, and mass detentions. And we see that after that, then that's how somebody like General Kago got shot and captured. And the battle that in which he lost and captured became a celebration in the colonial circles. So we've got this guy who had been giving them some troubles. And from there, we can say militarily, it was a downward hill. For General Kago, because he was such a bad man to the British, they had to transport his body and hands to Nairobi, mainly the hand, to verify that he was the one.
And they called the Africans the savages.
Right.
They called the Africans the savages.
So they cut his hand to go through the handprints and all those things. And then they returned and they cremated him in public, forcing everybody to watch that your hero is gone. By the time they got to Kimathi, the forces were depleted. That way we admit. But the political dynamics had changed. So when the general was saying this is not a military, it's a political, so they had to engage in political warfare. And the political warfare, that's when I think they cut a deal with the United States that the war will not be discussed at the United Nations. And actually, the British were furious when one person managed to raise a question in the place, somebody from Asia. So no discussions about the war at the United Nations. No information about what was going on. So we had a few Wazungus, the white people, who complained that there was something wrong and they were deported. There was one called Peter Evans. People were denied entry into Kenya if they were thought to be sympathetic to the Africans. Some Americans, some others. Total information control, propaganda. And so for the Mau to come up and penetrate that, because they did, until got their messages out there. Remember when there was Kenyatta's instructions in the 1940s, let your friends know outside there. So when the war broke out, the friends became interested. And they usually got the information and let the whole thing backfired. So, but apart from denying information, there was the effort to create new leadership. Because the bad ones were in jail, and Africans need to have their own leaders, so you create leaders.
From the British perspective.
Yes, the British now created leaders. The most effective of these created leaders was Tom Mboya. He was articulate, he was brilliant, he was photogenic, and he was a trade unionist. So that was, saying now, and he is not those people in jail. That's how Mboya was sold as the leader, not just of Africans in Kenya, leader of Africans.
Right.
And they sent him to England, to Oxford, not to get a degree, but to hobnob with the big powers, the policymakers. And then the Americans took him. So he went to the US, and the American Labor Union took him. The British were not amused because they used to say, he's ours, how come you've taken him?
Right.
And in Nairobi, he got a lot of money, he built us the headquarters of the Labor Union, Solidarity Building in Gekomba. That money. So they paid for his campaign in 1957, the first political campaign for Africans that were allowed. And he looked as if he might lose, so they sent $2,000 in those days. Today it will be a few millions equivalent, to ensure he did not lose to Agwin Skofek at the time. So he was their man, the leader. Then you have these others who came. Jaramogi, who was reported by Kenyatta, is also elected at the same time.
And we're talking about Jaramogi Odinga, who is Raila Odinga's father, right?
Yes.
Right. So, Professor.
An rivalry developed between these two men.
Right. Professor.
Because Kenyatta was supposed to die in jail, and he didn't die.
Professor.
So if he dies, who takes over?
Right, Professor. Could you put it in a broader context what you're talking about now? Because now we are talking about who inherited the Kenyan state after the armed resistance was over. Because now that would also allow us to discuss what Kenya became and what Kenya could have become had there been outright military victory, instead of the British co-opting the people that they allowed to inherit the power.
The grooming and the co-opting was part of the preparation for the post-colonial, because it was very clear that independence was coming. Who then should be given that independence? Kenyatta is in jail, and they are bad people.
Independence, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Who should get it? And the competition between the Americans and the British as to who controls Kenya after that. That explained all the education programs that were created in the late 1950s to see who succeeds. The end result was that there was this big rivalry between Mboya and Odinga as to who succeeds Kenyatta when he dies. The politics of Kenyatta's death. He didn't die. So after he comes out, arrangements are made. And since by the time of independence, there were commotions in Congo. And there were writings that Kenya, once it becomes independent, it will be worse than Congo. Because there had been a war in Kenya when there had been no war in Congo. So what you have there now is this Kenyatta and the people around him, none of them wanted another Congo. And they all wanted to be thought of well as responsible people. Kenyatta wanted to be seen as a responsible person.
Seeking that approval from the white man.
Yes.
Okay.
That's what he did. And it was acceptable because he has this now revolutionary legacy, pre-war, and now he is acceptable because he is wise. The symbolism of that acceptance was the meeting held in Nakuru, where he addressed a hall full of settlers very apprehensive of what he was going to say. When he stood up to speak, he entertained them by telling them he's one of them and they are part of him. They are all Kenyans. Yeah? And he said, we don't want you to go. You stay. We want you to teach our people how to do this. By the end of his speech, the settlers were jumping up and down, singing Jomo, Jomo, Jomo.
Lord have mercy.
No longer the enemy. So I tried to find out why he did that at one time. And I talked to one of his nephews of his, Njoroge Mungai, who was at the meeting. And he said, when they were going there, they had told Kenyatta what he should say, that we are going to get our land back.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time when he spoke, they looked at him and said, what's wrong with you? And then he explained to them why he did it. For one, he pointed out, these settlers are capable of creating chaos in this country.
Mm.
So do you want that? They say no. Okay. That is why. The Congo story was the one in the background there.
Mm.
Of course, some other argument would be he didn't need that. He had already agreed. Because one of the veterans I talked to kept on talking about what? The leopard and the in-laws. So there is this expression in Gikuyu that the lion, when it comes, is hunted by what?
I was about to say, yeah.
A person and the in-laws.
He had promises. There were promises.
Yeah, there were understandings.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why people were disappointed, because they were saying, this is not the Kenyatta we knew before the war.
So he sold the movement for his own families, his own selfish...
he betrayed the movement.
Yes.
Very clearly. And since there is evidence they believed him, and he used to say things they believed in, and he's the one who kept on emphasizing land and free.
Right. Yes.
And freedom. And when he became president, there was no land, and the freedom was questionable.
And there was no freedom. Nduku Adesoji.
So that's the problem with what happened. The pre-independence and then post-colonial.
Yeah.
And so they did not portray Kenyatta in a very positive way.
Leading up to...
And the people who took over power with Kenyatta, so these people who were groomed in the 1950s to take over because it was clear that the British government was leaving, but it will continue through their... The best example of that is somebody who was called Charles Njonjo. Used to be called Sir Charles, the Duke of Kabeteshire.
Lord have mercy, yes. I didn't like seeing that, yeah, but go on. Mm-hmm.
He died still almost Mzungu in black skin, yeah? Right. I think he's Frantz Fanon who was talking about blackface, whiteface. Yes. He symbolized that, and he was very proud of his Englishness. And he was the Attorney General.
Yeah,
very
different
powerful.
Things make different people happy. So
yeah, so that's how they took over. The people who took over were groomed, and they were not to be the Kenya Land and Freedom Army people.
Ideologically too. Ideologically, they were more in line there with the British, as opposed to a person like Odinga, who was an avowed socialist, and they would not allow that, of course, to happen.
I would disagree about Odinga being a socialist.
Ah, interesting.
He taught socialism, but he was not. He was thinking rich.
It's evident in the land the family owns.
Yeah, they own the people say they own almost the whole of Siaya.
It's evident in the land they own. Yes, you're right.
And the spectre.
So they feared his pronouncements, but not then. Okay.
You never know. But at the time, to give Odinga credit, what Odinga was raising was not so much socialism or communism. was saying we need to balance this thing. Yeah?
Okay.
The country has been so much under the West, the British. We need a little bit of the other side.
Okay. Understood.
In order to because that was the issue that was being debated.